Throughout the entire movie, you get the sense that Clark isn't just lonely, he's accepted loneliness. By the time we meet him, you already feel bad for him and get a sense that he is probably not a good person, somehow, all at the same time. You know that one guy whose wife kicks him out, who owns a failing furniture store, and who low-key has some anger issues? Yeah, I drew him. Today, we're talking about Clark from the Backrooms. Hey guys, I'm Frizzy. I make art and I have entirely too many opinions about fictional people. So if that sounds like something you would be into and you want to see how this illustration turns out, stick around. Quick spoiler warning, we're going to be talking about the events leading up to the show, flashbacks, and some details about Clark's life. So if you haven't seen Backrooms yet and would prefer to experience his questionable decisions firsthand, this is your chance to bounce. Okay, now that all the cool people are here, let's get into it. If you didn't fully enjoy the movie, let me explain why I think it's actually a cinematic masterpiece. I'm talking to you, Rotten Tomatoes. This thing didn't even start as a movie. It started as internet folklore. Just a bunch of anonymous posts and pictures of empty rooms with fluorescent lighting that somehow made everybody collectively uncomfortable. Somehow the entire internet looked at a picture of beige carpet and collectively said, there is something wrong. It's like a memory that was never formed. But it's literally just hallways and carpet and weird lighting, and yet your brain takes one look and goes, how do I get out of here? From that weird feeling and little corner of the internet, an entire story was born. And honestly, the story behind this movie is almost as wild as the movie itself. Because while Kane Pixels didn't invent the Backrooms, he absolutely launched it into the stratosphere. At just 16 years old, yes, I said 16 years old, he started making these short films on YouTube that ended up going ridiculously viral. And somehow this led to him becoming the youngest director in A24 history at just 20 years old. Which is wild because seriously, what was I even doing at 20? Don't answer that. Meanwhile, Kane's over here directing a major film with a $10 million budget that went on to gross over $200 million. Humanity really looked at pictures of walls and doors and carpets and said, yeah, put $10 million into that. And honestly, respect. And if that wasn't enough, apparently they built an absolutely massive practical set for this movie. We're talking 30,000 square feet spread across 4 separate sound stages, which sounds impressive until you find out that the set was so huge and disorienting that crew members reportedly got lost and needed maps every day just to navigate it. And honestly, that's hilarious to me. Imagine showing up to work and your boss hands you a map and says, don't worry, Kevin, if you hit the endless yellow hallway again, you've gone too far. Like, congratulations, you built the Backrooms so well that even the people making the movie got trapped in it. This is where I was kind of mapping out the sketch. I kind of regret not putting in as much detail. Honestly, I feel like I kind of mapped out his proportions a little bit off. It's kind of hard to tell because when you're focusing on like your own work for so long, it's just like, I don't know, you could literally make one eye the size of a pea and the other as the size of an orange and you just wouldn't notice. But I just feel like there's something a little bit off. I mean, maybe it's good that it looks a little uncanny. I don't know, kind of Backrooms themed. I don't know, but also I didn't really map out his like wrinkles on his face and like the details on his face, and I really, really, really regret that because there's such an important part of making him look like Clark. Each wrinkle on his face, each dark spot, I sound like I'm tearing him apart. I'm really not. I'm just looking at him from an artist point, and the sketch was not nearly as detailed enough as I wish it was. When we first meet Clark, his life is already hanging on by a thread. He's going through a divorce, battling alcoholism, and his furniture store is doing about as well as Blockbuster in 2010. And we learn all of this not through a flashback or some dramatic speech, but through his therapy session, which tells you a lot about the kind of story this is. Because before Clark ever gets trapped in the backrooms, he's already trapped in a life that's falling apart. And it's not just that Clark is getting divorced or that his drinking cost him his home, it's the way he talks about himself. In therapy, he says, "I hurt people. I don't want to, but it's just the way I'm wired." And then, almost as if he's trying to convince himself, he says, "Maybe I deserve to be alone." And that's what really, really stuck with me, honestly. Because throughout the entire movie, you get the sense that Clark isn't just lonely, he's accepted loneliness. By the time we meet him, you already feel bad for him and get a sense that he is probably not a good person, somehow all at the same time. And at this point in the movie, you're hoping that he learns from his mistakes and gets a happy ending. Now, this is just my theory, but I don't actually think Clark wanted to be in therapy. The whole thing feels less like someone seeking help and more like someone who's attending a mandatory meeting issued by the court, which would make sense if he did physically abuse his wife. Either way, he's stressed, he's isolated, he needs to be in control of everything, and maybe most importantly, he lacks a lot of self-awareness. Even when he's talking about his marriage, he spends more time blaming his wife than asking what role he played in all of this. Which is interesting because the one thing that actually seems to light him up is architecture. And while Clark is in the middle of his divorce, we get this small but important glimpse into who he is outside of therapy. While filming a commercial for his furniture store, he puts on the Captain Clark costume, this goofy pirate mascot that's supposed to represent fun and charm. But the moment quickly turns sad when Clark breaks the chair beneath him, and I don't think that was just a throwaway gag. To me, it's one of the earliest examples of Clark's self-defeating mentality in action. Instead of laughing it off or moving on, you can almost feel the shame and frustration underneath it all. It's like every setback becomes proof that he's broken, that he ruins things, that he hurts people. This scene is important, and I want you to keep it in the back of your mind because we're actually going to come back to it later. There's a theory connected to this moment that I think makes the ending even more interesting. I wanted to start somewhere where I felt comfortable. Eyes are kind of my safe space because I know how eyes work. I know how shadows are. I'm like comfortable with eyes. And then I went down to his nose and his lips, and I was just kind of going in a safe zone. I stayed away from his cheek and his forehead because I was like really intimidated. Once I realized what was ahead of me, I stayed away from it for a while. So when I finally did go into the areas around his facial features, it took me a lot longer than I thought. And it was definitely the hardest part, but it was a learning experience, honestly. I usually do draw like women. I just usually draw women or younger people with more smooth, less dimensional faces than this. So it was honestly a really good learning experience to understand how to paint like certain like parts, like folds, I guess, in his, I don't want to sound mean, like different like bumps and folds on his face, you know, like it was really, I had to like figure out how to make it look okay. And I don't think it's perfect, but I think that I made it look okay. And now, honestly, now I know how to draw or paint and illustrate like wrinkles. And so it was a good learning experience. So Clark likes structure, he likes things that fit together, things you can understand, things you can control, but people aren't controllable. People aren't structured. And I think that's part of the tragedy because you get the sense that Clark understands buildings a lot better than he understands himself and the people around him. Bravo to the writers because it sets up the irony of the Backrooms so perfectly. He loves architecture and structure, and then he gets dropped into a place made entirely of impossible architecture, almost like the universe handed him a giant maze and said, "Cool, since you think everything has a blueprint, let's see how you handle this." So after therapy, Clark does what I imagine a lot of people going through a divorce do. He sleeps at the furniture store, which first of all is kind of crazy and a little depressing. This place is already struggling, and now it's basically become his apartment. His marriage is falling apart, his business is failing, and he's spending his nights surrounded by couches and dining room sets. And then strange things start happening. The lights begin flickering, there's something weird going on around the electrical panel area. Little things that are easy to dismiss if you're stressed enough. But then Clark notices something that shouldn't be there. A crack of light shining through the wall. I loved this part. I loved how this was the beginning of the Backrooms. Just so subtle and so perfect. Now, if this were me, I'd call literally anybody else before investigating it myself. Maybe an electrician, a landlord, maybe a priest. I don't know, but Clark does what horror protagonists have been doing since the beginning of time. He, of course, investigates it by himself. And that's what I love about this scene, though, because the entrance to the Backrooms isn't some ancient temple or creepy basement with warning signs. It's just a little off. It's just wrong. It's this tiny imperfection in reality, which is so Backrooms. And because Clark is curious, because he likes solving problems and understands how things work, he leans in, and that's when everything breaks. Of course, Clark falls through the wall and experiences what's called a no-clip event, basically reality glitches. 1 second he's standing in a store, and the next he's crossed some invisible threshold into a place that shouldn't exist. And I think that's important because Clark doesn't enter the Backrooms through a door. He slips through a crack, literally in reality, and suddenly he's surrounded by endless hallways and liminal spaces that feel strangely familiar. Not quite a dream, not quite reality, just somewhere in between. This is his and the audience's first real experience in the Backrooms. In the Backrooms, he's wandering around, he's hearing strange noises, things don't add up, none of this should make sense. But for some reason, he keeps trying to explain it away, which kind of fits with who he is. We know that Clark needs things to make sense. He likes structure, he likes answers, so instead of accepting that reality might be broken, he keeps searching for a rational explanation. He grabs a chair on his way out, maybe for further inspection, but I think mostly for evidence because part of him still needs validation. He still wants proof. He still wants somebody else to look at this thing and say, no, you're not crazy, this happened. And eventually, after being rejected by his ex-wife and therapist, and when he tries to tell them, that need starts to disappear. He stops trying to convince other people, he stops trying to make sense of everything, and that's when he slowly stops caring whether they make sense at all. At first, Clark is just trying to survive. He's confused, disoriented, and completely out of his element, but that doesn't last very long. Pretty quickly, he starts doing what Clark does best. He starts mapping, tracking patterns, collecting objects, and measuring space. And that's when I realized something. Clark isn't just surviving, he's literally studying it. Maybe it's because architecture has always been his way of understanding the world, or maybe for the first time in a long time, he has a problem he thinks he can actually solve. Well, fear, of course, turns into curiosity. Curiosity turns into routine, and routine starts looking a lot like obsession. Because the longer Clark stays in the Backrooms, the more his thought stops making sense and starts resembling the endless, nonsensical world of the Backrooms. So my color choices were crazy. I'll admit that now, because I literally didn't want to just do like one color, like one light color, no. 2, no, 3. I did 3. Yeah, and I kind of like it, but I honestly, I don't know. It was really hard. It was really hard, especially on a shirt. And you'll see me like blocking out the colors now. So I did yellow and then orange in the center and then green. I really wanted it to have like yellow because obviously the Backrooms. And then I was like, no, let me add a little warmth in there. Like, I don't know, just a little warmth. And then I was like, but what about the green glowing? Because there's moments in the Backroom movie where there's like green glowing lights and there's some, some theories on that. And green glowing is very like horror. It gives very like, I don't know, monster feeling. So I just wanted to add that in, but yeah, it was definitely a challenge, especially again with all his details and how those colors kind of bounced off his face. It was really hard guessing where everything went, but I did it. I guess I did it. Eventually, Clark decides to bring 2 of his employees with him, which is honestly interesting because after spending so much time alone, he suddenly wants witnesses. Nonetheless, together they descend deeper into the back rooms, following this hallway that just keeps going down. And if there's one thing that horror movies have taught me, it's that nothing good happens after you descend into a deeper, darker pit. This is where I personally would have clocked out and went home, but to each their own. And of course, that's when everything goes wrong. Something attacks them. There's chaos, running, panic, and then we don't even really know what happened afterwards. Which brings me to a theory. Was Clark using his coworkers as bait? Not consciously necessarily. I don't think Clark is some mastermind villain, but throughout the movie, he tends to put his own needs for answers above the people around him. And considering his history, considering what he says in therapy about hurting people, honestly, I can't help but wonder if that's exactly what just happened. He's just continuing to hurt people. Eventually, Clark leaves a voicemail for his therapist, which is strange because, really, after everything he's experienced, after all this isolation and all the time spent alone, the person he reaches out to isn't his wife or, I don't know, like his cousin. There is definitely some strange attachment going on. She is the only person who's been listening to him all along, so I guess that would make sense, but she also gets crazy points because instead of writing him off as delusional, she actually goes looking for him, which, first of all, that is some serious commitment. Even if one of my friends left me a voicemail that sounded like it came from another dimension, I don't know if I'd be grabbing a flashlight and heading toward the mystery wall, but she does, and somehow she finds the back rooms. Here's a theory I haven't been able to stop thinking about. There's this idea that her mother may have had access to the back rooms when she was a child, or at least experienced something similar, which would explain why she doesn't immediately dismiss Clark, not because she necessarily believes every word he's saying, but because something about it feels familiar. We do get to see flashbacks of her mom, and I don't think they would include it without it having some meaning. It's almost like she's heard echoes of this story before. Maybe she was searching for answers she'd been carrying around long before she ever met him. I don't want to go too much into it because this video is about Clark, but I kind of love her character. So if you do want me to make a video on her, let me know because I think she deserves her own deep dive. But to summarize what happens after she makes it into the back rooms, when she finally finds Clark, something has changed. Instead of relief or even gratitude that he's not alone anymore, the way Clark approaches her is bone chilling. There's something off. Really something is off. And it just feels uncanny. Side note, some people have speculated that it's not actually Clark at all, but some weird Backrooms version of him. I don't necessarily buy that theory, but I do think something is horribly wrong with him. Because here's what freaked me out. He's not dirty, he's not bruised, he's not bloody like you would expect. Clearly time has passed since the incident with his coworkers, but he almost just looks untouched. And the look on his face, it was just so unsettling. This was the moment where I think the audience was both confused and terrified because nobody really knew what was going to happen next. Then they both hear a noise. And before she even gets a chance to see what it is, Clark blindsides her and strangles her unconscious. And I don't know, I absolutely loved this scene. Between the drawings on the walls and that strange stare Clark had, this was peak Backrooms. Next, we see the therapist wake up tied to a chair, and across from her sits Clark, which I honestly don't think anybody saw coming. This is the moment the movie shifts from Clark versus the Backrooms to the therapist versus the Backrooms and Clark. And to make the situation even worse, he's surrounded by these entities known as still lives, and they are so unsettling. They don't really move, they don't seem capable of thought, they're just distorted, almost warped in the same way the Backrooms themselves are. But oh my gosh, guys, the one with the lamp had me in a chokehold. He was positioned right behind her, and he just kept doing these subtle little movements like, and I was like, oh my God, he's gonna attack her. Oh, and I don't know why, but it just freaked me out more than anything because he's not like aggressive, he's not charging at her or anything, but it's just the watching, and it's just somehow worse. I don't know. And then Clark starts talking, and this is where things got really interesting for me because it's almost like Clark successfully figured out the backrooms. He's just hanging out with these creatures like they're his besties, which is actually kind of sad because it made me wonder if he ever really actually wanted to be alone. Because otherwise, why surround himself with all these things? Why force people to stay with him, including his therapist? And then there's this theory that the red-haired still life is actually his wife, which is horrifying if it's true, because that means even after losing her, he's still forcing her to stay beside him. But as he's explaining all of this, he starts describing what the backrooms actually are and how the rooms change and how they repeat and recreate things. And he says it's almost like the place itself is alive, or at least it's capable of remembering. He compares it to memory. All of a sudden, Clark casually explains that he's then eating them, which when I saw him rip a piece out of the still life stomach, it hit me like a truck. It was a shocking thing to see. It looked like ooey gooey foam, white and puffy. I don't know. There are theories that it's actually made of mushroom. Basically, this theory suggests that everything in the backrooms is actually like fungal, and it grows and spreads just like a giant organism growing in the patterns of human memory, which is a really fascinating theory. But I have to be honest, I don't think it made me feel any better. So this is where we find out the reason he lured his therapist here in the first place. He wanted to recreate his therapy session, but this time he wanted her to tell him he is not the problem. Yeah, and Slay Queen, she refuses to tell him what he wants to hear. If she is gonna die, she might as well finally tell one of her patients the truth that she can't fix them. And she goes berserk on him, throwing his own words right back at him. It's really satisfying, honestly. She says, "It's just the way you're wired, isn't it?" All movie long, Clark has refused to take accountability until this point. It's like nobody has ever actually told him that it is him and he's the reason for all of his problems. Then Clark says his first honest thing, "For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm right where I'm supposed to be." And I think he means it because the Backrooms doesn't judge. The still lives don't leave him. Nothing asks him to grow. Nothing holds him accountable. And then she says something beautiful. She doesn't tell him he's crazy. She doesn't tell him he's evil. She simply says, "Then stay, but let me go." And to me, that's acceptance, not approval. She's accepting Clark exactly as he is while refusing to be trapped with him. And I think in a strange way, they both accept him for who he is in that moment. Not who he used to be, not who he could become, just who he is. And then, just as they reach this bizarre understanding, they hear a noise. I was gripping at my seat at this point because at that point, nobody knew what the entity was going to look like before it walked in. And you just heard this noise coming, and it felt like it took forever for the entity to come into the room. And then we finally see it. Our first real look after the, I don't know, maybe hour and some that it took. And we finally get to see this entity. And honestly, I have to admit, I was not expecting this because it's not some giant monster or eldritch nightmare kind of thing. It's literally Clark, or at least a version of Clark. He's wearing the Captain Clark outfit, except this version is distorted, unsettling, and fully capable of hurting the people around him, which I think is such a fascinating choice because throughout the entire movie, Clark keeps saying that he hurts people. He blames his drinking, his circumstances, even his own wiring. But he rarely stops to examine himself, and now, standing right in front of him is the physical embodiment of everything he's always feared he was. Not an alien, not some ancient evil. Clark. Literally just Clark. Well, maybe more accurately, the version of himself he spent his whole life running from. What struck me is that this thing isn't random. It's violent, it's destructive, it's dangerous. Everything Clark believes himself to be. Maybe they were showing him exactly what he thought he deserved. Because in a movie about loneliness, guilt, and self-destruction, what better monster could there be than yourself? And this is where the movie completely pulled the rug out from under me. After Clark finally accepts himself, after saying that for the first time in a long time, he feels like he's right where he's supposed to be, the entity that had been sparing him this entire time suddenly walks in with a purpose. And the look on Clark's face says everything. He's confused, almost betrayed, like he genuinely thought he understood this place. Like he thought he had finally figured out the rules, but Captain Clark doesn't see him as a friend. It doesn't see him as a part of the family he's built with the Still Lives either. It sees him as an enemy, and before anybody can react, it picks him up and eats him. And I remember just sitting there thinking, wait, what? Because in that moment, everything changed. Clark, the guy who spent the whole movie trying to map the backrooms, studying them, living among them, even explaining them to other people, turned out to understand them just as little as we did. And I think that's what I love most about this ending. Clark wasn't a prophet. He wasn't the chosen one. He didn't conquer the backrooms or unlock some grand truth. He was just another person trying to make sense of something impossible. And the second he thought he finally belonged, the backrooms reminded him that it doesn't owe anybody answers. Which, strangely enough, makes the place feel even bigger, scarier, and far more mysterious than if Clark had actually solved it. His shirt killed me, guys. His shirt killed me. I spent a lot of time on his shirt. I waited until the last moment that I could do it because I knew, of course, it's white. It's just a white. I think it's like actually like maybe yellow, but it's like a pale color shirt. But of course, I had to include all the colors. So I had to find where the green light was going to hit, and then the orange, and then the yellow. So it was definitely tricky, and I don't know if I perfected it by the end, but yeah, it took me quite a bit. Before I wrap this up, I want to talk about a few theories because the more I thought about this ending, the more I started questioning everything. I mentioned before the theory that the red-haired still life is actually Clark's wife. When Captain comes into the room, she moves for the first time, running and sprinting away into a corner. I think this gives this theory even more weight because of course she would react like that towards the monster version of him, especially if the backrooms also held versions of her faults and traumas. Captain Clark spends most of the movie attacking other people, just like Clark emotionally lashes out at the people around him. Yet the moment Clark finally stops running, accepts himself, and maybe even takes responsibility for who he is, Captain Clark turns on himself. Almost like for the first time, Clark's blame finally points inward. And that makes me wonder about the other still lives and why Captain Clark bleeds. Why does this thing seem different? Why does it hurt? Why does it leave behind evidence that it's more than just another creature? Some people think Captain Clark is actually the real Clark who just morphed and changed the longer he spent in the backrooms. I don't know if I personally believe that, but it definitely does raise some questions. Looking back on it, I don't think Clark was some random victim. In a weird way, he was the perfect person to find the backrooms. He had the architectural background, he had the curiosity, and after losing his marriage, his home, and almost everything else, he had very little left to lose, which makes it all the more tragic. Because out of everyone in the movie, Clark probably understood the backrooms better than anybody else. He mapped them, studied them, lived among them, and even learned how to survive there. But in the end, all of that knowledge still wasn't enough. And I know this movie isn't going to be for everybody. It's kind of weird, the plot isn't typical, and I completely understand why some people might hate it, but I think that's also why it stuck with me. Days later, I was still thinking about it. The sound design, the dreamlike atmosphere, the constant feeling that something wasn't right, it felt like being trapped inside an anxious dream that you can't quite wake up from. And maybe that's the point. I don't think there is any solving the backrooms. I think trying to understand them is as endless as the backrooms themselves. Every answer just creates more questions. Every theory opens another hallway, and maybe that's why people keep coming back to them. I found myself clenching my butt cheeks the entire movie, and more than once I had to remind myself to breathe. And I noticed the audio was so subtle, but the whole time there was this like rolling static thumping sound that almost felt like it was coming from inside my body. I don't know. Maybe it was just my heart trying to escape my chest, but it made me genuinely feel terrified. And even though we didn't get a traditional character arc or a neatly wrapped up plot, we all left with questions. And I think that's kind of the beautiful part of the movie. Because just like the original concept on the internet, the movie doesn't really end when the credits roll. It keeps going. It comes back in the form of theories, discussions, and hundreds of people arguing over what they think it all means. And to me, that's a success. So props to the writers, the directors, and the actors. I think they made something special, not because they solved the backrooms, but because they reminded us why we fell in love with the whole concept in the first place. Now, if you excuse me,
I need to go unclench.
okay, so this is the final result, guys. Honestly, it's not my best work. It's not my best work, but I did really, really enjoy doing it, and it was really fun to paint him. I kind of felt like an eerie feeling because in that photo, he's just kind of looking out and staring. And honestly, when I was drawing it, I did feel a little bit like a little sense of like something. Like it kind of made me nervous a little bit. I don't know how to explain it, but it was a fun drawing to do. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I had an absolute blast painting Clark and diving way too deep into his character. And if you enjoyed this video, let me know what your favorite theory was down below, and if you'd like to see me draw and overanalyze a therapist next. Until next time, I'm Frizzy. The drawing's finished, but the analysis is just getting started. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye! 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 Ow. I hurt. I hurt. Hurry, turn it off, turn it off.